In 1960, Egypt began its involvement in United Nations peacekeeping operations with 2 paratrooper companies deployed to the UN operation in the Republic of Congo. Today, it's one of the top troop and police contributing countries with more than 3,000 men and women peacekeepers deployed in 7 operations in Africa. Egypt is also a critical player in shaping peacekeeping doctrinal and policy debates. To celebrate the 60th anniversary of Egypt's contribution to UN peacekeeping, we are joined in this first episode by Ambassador Ihab Awad, Deputy Assistant Foreign Minister for UN Affairs. In that capacity, Ambassador Awad heads the National Coordination Committee on Peacekeeping, which brings together various ministries and government agencies responsible for Egyptian deployments and for guiding the evolution of policy. He brings a wealth of experience, including serving as Deputy Permanent Representative of Egypt to the United Nations and a Senior Officer of the UN Peacebuilding Commission. Ambassador Awad, welcome. It's a great pleasure and honor having you with us today.
Thank you very much, Roland. It is my pleasure and honor to be part of this important activity marking 60th anniversary of Egypt's contribution to peacekeeping, and it's always a pleasure to be part of CCCPA's activities. I thank you very much for your very generous and kind introduction. And I'm looking forward to this interview and to all the activities that is led by CCCPA in connection with peacekeeping, peace building, and conflict resolution. So it is my real pleasure.
Thank you, Ambassador. So actually, the COVID-19 pandemic is a stark reminder that global problems require global solutions and that multilateralism is needed now more than ever before. Peacekeeping has been a flagship activity of the United Nations. For many people around the world, it's actually the UN. Looking back at 60 years of Egyptian contributions to UN peacekeeping, how do you explain Egypt's steadfast commitment to this endeavor? What motivates Egypt not only to continue to contribute, but also to increase and diversify its commitments? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Roland. As you know, Egypt is a founding and a very active member of the United Nations. A true believer in multilateralism historically, and a true believer in the unparalleled international legitimacy embodied in the UN Charter, in the UN decisions and policy frameworks. So this is the starting point that motivates Egypt and was behind Egypt's steadfast commitment to one of the most important and critical activities of the United Nations. As you rightly mentioned, it is a flagship activity of the United Nations. So it is the belief and the conviction in the power of the United Nations and the principles embodied in its charter and the legitimacy it offers to all the activities that it leads that has motivated Egypt's very early on contribution to peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping is a defining activity of the UN, and it's probably one of its most valuable instruments in the maintenance of international peace and security, and in meeting the aspiration of its founding members to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's the primary purpose of the United Nations. And in this sense, while peacekeeping was not necessarily mentioned as an activity as such in the Charter, it has evolved as an instrument, very valuable instrument for the United Nations to actually meet one of its primary objectives and goals in the maintenance of international peace and security. So from the early days, Egypt was both a host and a contributor to the earliest generation of UN peacekeeping operations. As you would recall, the UN emergency deployment in 1948 in connection with the 1948 war, the Arab-Israeli war, and of course was an earlier contributor later on, as you rightly mentioned, in the Congo ONUC operation later on in the 1960s. So historically for Egypt, UN peacekeepers were considered as enablers of the right to self-determination, and also as enablers to the transition from colonialism to the new wave of independence. This is a primary goal that defined Egypt's foreign policy at that time, in the 1950s and 60s primarily, and has defined also Egypt's global commitment to the new world that was taking shape in the 1950s and 60s. Later on, UN peacekeepers were considered as enablers of political settlements between and among states, newly independent and fighting around resources, border disputes inherited from the imperial period. So the UN peacekeepers were deployed to enable the new generation of states to settle their differences, to draw their borders, and to agree on a way to live together peacefully. So that was also a very important function of UN peacekeeping in the earlier versions of UN peacekeeping. Much later, in a different version, UN peacekeepers were considered as enablers of political solutions and political settlements within the states in the context of intrastate conflicts. Especially those kinds of conflicts emerged in the post-Cold War era, in the early 1990s and throughout the 90s and early 2000s. So as you can see, Egypt as an active member of the UN and also as an active member of the region where most of these events and issues and activities took place, mainly in the Middle East and the Arab world and in Africa, found itself committed to supporting the international engagement through UN peacekeeping in the resolution and management of these problems and issues arising from the post-colonial period over a period of at least 3 decades. As I mentioned, most of these UN peacekeeping activities took place and deployments in Africa and in the developing world generally, and Egypt has always been committed to the welfare and legitimate concerns of its brothers and sisters in Africa and in the Arab world. So this is probably to give you an overview and to answer your question about what motivates Egypt to start early on as an active troop and later on peace contributor, and to diversify its contribution over the decades. Most recently, as you know, while a very active and a large contributor of military components and military observers, it has become also one of the leading police contributing countries with the police component of modern United Nations peacekeeping operations gained prominence and gained increasing importance in fulfillment of UN peacekeeping mandates. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So, Ambassador, you held several positions during your experience. So, as the Deputy Permanent Representative of Egypt to the United Nations in New York during the country's 5th term on the UN Security Council, how would you assess Egypt's normative contributions to the ongoing reform process of UN peacekeeping and peace building, including by presenting a unified African position through the multiple events organized between Cairo, Addis Ababa, and New York in the last 5 years? The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Roland. So, as you know, Egypt's most recent membership term on the Security Council coincided with a critical phase for UN peacekeeping and UN peace building together. It came in 2016 and it started in 2016 and throughout the years 2016 and 2017, meaning that it followed the year 2015, where two very important reviews have taken place. The first one is the 2015 report and review led by the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations, or HIPPO. And also, it followed the 2015 United Nations Peace Building Architecture Review. These two important reviews in 2015 witnessed very active Egyptian contribution in various forms as part of its membership then in 2015 of the Peace Building Commission, where a lot of the discussions that led to the adoption of the famous 2016 twin resolutions, or in the form of interacting actively as the permanent mission of Egypt in 2015 with the members of the high-level independent panels throughout the various events, workshops, discussions that took place in New York and as well as in the field. Egypt then was among the top 2 contributing countries, and it was very important for the members of the high-level independent panel to interview and to interact with the leading 2 contributing countries on the ground as they prepared for their seminal and very important review and report. So that's one side of the contribution to the evolution of the new approach to peacekeeping and to peace building. So in 2016, and following this critical year of 2015, where these 2 reviews took place, Egypt became a member of the Security Council, as you rightly noted. And since it was very actively involved in both exercises, it took upon itself and has prioritized as part of its plan and its priorities on the Security Council, as member of the Security Council, to take forward the very important recommendations and policy approaches that emanated from these 2 reviews. Hence was the very active contribution of Egypt in the normal development of the next generation of peacekeeping and the primary link of peacekeeping to peace building and to the notion of the primacy of politics. That without, both reviews concluded that without an overarching political strategy that defines the mandate of peacekeeping and the engagement in peace building efforts, those efforts will not be effective and will not really yield the aspired for results. So, as a member of the Security Council, Egypt wanted to make sure that those recommendations take shape in the resolutions adopted by the Security Council. It has been appointed as the coordinator of the advisory role of the Peacebuilding Commission to the Security Council, with specific focus on that advisory capacity of the Peacebuilding Commission during the formation, review, and exit and transition of UN peacekeeping missions. And hence, Egypt played a practical role in taking forward the outcome of the 2015 major policy documents, and to make sure they are translated into practical approach and policies by the Security Council. And in parallel, it maintained its membership on the Peacebuilding Commission and has had the twin role of making sure that these normative developments, they take shape in real life. An example to that was the very important Security Council Resolution 2333, defining the plan for the transition of United Nations mission in Liberia. And Liberia had UNMIL, the UN mission in Liberia, deployed at that time. And also Liberia was an agenda item on the Peacebuilding Commission. So in its capacity, Egypt played a major role in informing the transition plan adopted by the Security Council through Resolution 2333 to enable a very orderly and a very unique transition from peacekeeping to peacekeeping. In connection with the same, and as the President first time of the Security Council in May 2016, and I take a very special pride that the Permanent Mission of Egypt and CCCPA partnered to organize a ministerial meeting, breakfast, in New York to launch the Egyptian presidency of the Security Council, hosted ministers that represented members of the Security Council, and nominees for the position of the United Nations Secretary General at that time. The time was in 2016, was the final year of the former Secretary General, and it was the campaign by different individuals to become the new UN Secretary General. That breakfast hosted most of those nominees, and the theme of that breakfast and the discussion between ministers and the nominees for the UN Secretary General position was around the new concept that was introduced in that breakfast called the peace continuum. And the peace continuum was introduced in that event as a defining approach to the future of peacekeeping and the interlinkage with peacebuilding. And it was later on adopted by the incoming Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, as one of his main ideas and philosophies for the reform of the peace and security pillar of the United Nations, which caters to the next generation and the reforms of UN peacekeeping, which was behind the idea of the Action for Peace initiative that came later on. So this gives you an idea of the very unique and significant contribution by Egypt as that time the President of the Security Council, with the incoming Secretary General, to really push for the question of the peace continuum, meaning that the role of peacekeeping operation is to actually lead to a longer term resolution of conflict rather than just managing the conflict and keep it at bay, keep the guns silenced without necessarily finding long-lasting solution, which is actually the function of the peace-building dimension. So this is one of the most significant contributions by Egypt and by CCCPA in support of that contribution. And later on, in the second presidency of Egypt on the Security Council in August 2017, Egypt thought it will take a step further and organize an open debate of the Security Council, where around more than 120 members of the Security Council participated on the contribution of peacekeeping to peacebuilding. And as a result of that debate, the outcome of that debate culminated in a presidential statement by the Security Council, where Egypt led the drafting and the negotiations on the Security Council, and ended up in the Security Council Presidential Statement number 27 for the year 2017, adopted on the 23rd of December 2017, very, very late in Egypt's second year term and end of the membership term, which also defined the question of what is the role of peacekeeping in supporting longer-term peace building, and it has become part and parcel of that particular section and sector in the 2018 initiative by the Secretary General Action for Peacekeeping. Later on, and after the Security Council membership, and with the introduction of the Action for Peacekeeping initiative, again, the government of Egypt with CCCPA partnered and organized, and this comes to your second part of the question about the African catering to a unified African position. We organized the Cairo high-level regional conference on the performance of peacekeeping operations from mandate to exit, where we both hosted the all African stakeholders and gave them the platform to contribute their views to the initiative by the Secretary General, the Action for Peacekeeping initiative. And this is the regional conference that produced later on the Cairo roadmap on enhancing the performance of peacekeeping operations from mandate to exit, which later on became, in principle, the African common position on the reform of peacekeeping operations. So it is a long road that started in 2015 and ended in 2018. And it's needless to say that also through CCCPA and later on the government of Egypt, we became an integral part of the new strategy and policy guidance on a very important dimension of peacekeeping operation, which is DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration as well. So the Egypt's contribution to the normative development of peacekeeping and specific aspects of peacekeeping did not necessarily confine itself to the membership on the Security Council. It started before and it's still continuing thereafter. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. While it might be too early to assess in definitive ways the impact of COVID-19 on peacekeeping, in your opinion, what would you consider as the most important factors that will determine the future of peacekeeping? Is it the changing geostrategic landscape or the financial crisis facing the UN? Why will the newly established mission in Sudan be a model of post-COVID-19 peacekeeping? Over to you, Ambassador.
This is a very important question and really very difficult to answer at this stage. But what is here for certain is that COVID-19 has had an impact on the performance of existing peacekeeping operations in the field due to the restriction on the movement of troops, on the movement of personnel, the restrictions imposed by the countries, the host countries themselves, on the rotation and the change of troops and components, as you know, of course, in CCCPA, since you provide training, pre-deployment training to our troops. So it has already impacted on the performance and on the advancement of the implementation of certain mandates. That's for sure. But the future of peacekeeping will be determined, as you rightly mentioned, by many other factors. I would say yes, the changing geostrategic landscape, the current increasing polarization within the Security Council between the most powerful countries and among the P5 themselves will have an impact on the quality of the mandates, which requires consensus, and consensus primarily among the P5 in order for peacekeeping to advance. One of the most important factors that led to the spread of the peacekeeping as an instrument of a UN in the mid-2000s and until, I would say, the beginning of the 2000s and until perhaps 2015 and 2016, for those 15 years, the post-Brahimi report on the reform of peace operations was that there was unique consensus among the P5 on the importance of peacekeeping. I am afraid that the current polarization might actually impact that consensus and hence the quality of the mandate, the quality of the review process of the mandate, and the decision, informed decisions on drawdown and withdrawal, rather than and based on analysis as to how much of the peace and of the mandate has been achieved and fulfilled, and how much capacity therein within the specific countries where the peacekeeping operation is deployed to manage tension and manage its own issues peacefully within solid and capacitated institutions, peace building dimension. And that should be, these are the factors that should inform the decision by the Security Council to start the drawdown, rather than merely politicizing the drawdown decision or prioritizing the financial dimension, the financial, the budgetary consideration behind the scope of the mandate, the size of the mission, and so on and so forth. As it stands now, that polarization, which reflects the larger geostrategic landscape and the financial crunch that comes out of the current COVID-19 pandemic and its financial and economic impact, as well as the shift by powerful member states on the Security Council towards from multilateralism as the solution to global problems to unilateralism and inward-looking approach rather than outward-looking and global engagement. All of these might be factors that would define the future of peacekeeping operation. That's one. The other one is a real analytical approach to the relevance of peacekeeping as it stands to solving the existing and prevailing conflicts and issues and challenges facing fragile and conflict-affected states. And this goes back to the point in my earlier response to your second question about whether peacekeeping operations is able to provide the role of an enabler for political solutions, an enabler for an international partnership with the country concerned, with the host state, to build and capacitate its own institutions and really support the question of national ownership. That host state owns its own problems and build its own security forces based on certain principles and standards in order to take care of its own security and political and economic issues. Whether the future peacekeeping mandates and the future peacekeeping deployments will actually prioritize that aspect vis-a-vis simply physical protection of civilians, as it is now one of its main priorities, and the shift towards the larger and broad protection concept, which is protection with a view to resilience, building resilience in these societies, supporting these societies to build a strong and solid social contract. That is going to be the defining question for the future of peacekeeping operations, among others, but this is, in my view, will be the test case. This has to be applied as an approach and put into practice across the board in the existing deployments. From MINUSMA in Mali, which is very, very different from the context where MINUSCA in the Central African Republic is deployed, for example, which is very, very different from the phase where MONUSCO in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is deployed, let alone other deployments such as UNFICYP in Cyprus, UNIFIL in Lebanon, and UNMISS in South Sudan. These different contexts require tailored and different approaches driven by the question of building resilience within these societies, prioritizing investment in national capacities, in national ownership, and in national institutions. And I truly hope that this could still be the action for peacekeeping way forward. Unfortunately, there is now focus more on the operational aspects of the performance of peacekeeping operations, from training to conduct and discipline by troops, to the quality of equipments, and many of the aspects that reflects that certain financial contributors and members of the Security Council are still thinking about peacekeeping from the standpoint of stopping bloodshed and keeping putting bandage on the wounds of societies and states, rather than conducting a surgical operation where the wounds can heal quicker and for good. So that will be very, very much the big question mark about the future of peacekeeping operations. Ending with your last part of your question about the newly established mission in Sudan and whether this will be a model of the post-COVID-19 peacekeeping, I would delink it from post-COVID-19 per se, and I see where you're coming from here in terms of how small it is and how relatively cheaper it is when compared to MONUSCO or UNMISS or UNAMID, for example. But I would say yes and no. The new UNITAMS, which is the name of the new mission in Sudan, would have not been possible if it wasn't for a long-term deployment of UNAMID and some sort of normalcy returning to Darfur. But also, it would have not been possible if it wasn't for the political transition that took place in Sudan in 2019, in April 2019, which brought a national determination by the Sudanese themselves to use the United Nations political security approach, not necessarily physical deployment of military components and police components, but the other aspects of peacekeeping that were less celebrated over the past 10, 15 years in the form of mediation and support to political transition, support to national reconciliation, support to the DDR process, support to the SSR process. Those were aspects of the earlier peacekeeping mandates, and they're still aspects of UNITAM's mandate, but they are brought to the fore, and they are driven by a national transition led by the Sudanese themselves. So yes and no, whether UNITAMS would actually fit all the contexts. I think it fits very well in the context of Sudan. It might not necessarily fit other contexts in the same way, so we have to wait and see how other missions and other contexts will evolve in the next few months and years. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Awad. We are really grateful for your insightful contributions and for sharing your experience with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.